Hey all, here are OS Reviews. In 2023, Sony smartphones, at least in the US, are not as popular as they once were. They're more like enthusiast choices in this day and age, with their rather unconventional design traits, such as the super stretched 21:9 aspect ratio. However, just like LG, I think they're kind of underrated, and there's a lot of characteristics that make their phones actually quite memorable and fun to use. So today we're taking a revisited look at the Sony Xperia 1 here in 2023. This is a smartphone that came out in 2019, and it's the start of the One line that continues to persist to this day. In fact, Sony recently unveiled the One Mark V, which shares pretty similar design characteristics as this original model, but of course with upgraded internals and even better camera hardware. But still, in terms of dimensions, all of the One line are quite similar, with 6.5-inch 4K resolution OLED screens, that is by Sony's definition, which is more specifically 1644 by 3840 pixels. And like many folks, it kind of reminds me of a remote control in the hand just because of how tall this phone is. Sony claims that this provides you with a more cinematic widescreen experience if you are watching back videos, kind of similar to movie theaters and IMAX films, but we'll touch on that point more later on. And though it's a little bit confusing, I'll mention that Sony's current lineup also includes the Xperia 5 and the Xperia 10 devices, which also have a tall 21:9 aspect ratio, but have less powerful chips and cameras as well. So the Xperia 5 is more of their mid-tier line, and the Xperia 10 is more of their more budget-conscious series, versus the 1 is kind of their pro, aka most expensive line. It is a little unfortunate, though, that Sony has kind of stopped making ultra-compact flagship smartphones, such as the XZ3 Compact that we revisited several months back. But this was kind of the start of a kind of new design direction for Sony, and these days, if you're looking for a compact flagship Android phone, it's really just Asus making them under their Zenfone line, and that's pretty much all you have option-wise. Now on the rear here, we have three 12-megapixel cameras. There's a primary lens with optical image stabilization. There's also a 12-megapixel ultra-wide-angle lens, and another 12-megapixel telephoto zoom lens, but it's a 2x optical zoom. So not the highest magnification, to be completely honest, but all three are more practical in my opinion compared to, say, monochrome or macro lenses. So at least they are generally useful enough if you are taking lots of photos and recording video. Otherwise, the aluminum frame on the side does feel extremely reassuring and well built. The back of the phone is also made out of Gorilla Glass, and we have on the edges a fingerprint scanner, but the power key is actually positioned slightly below it. So they're not integrated into one placement anymore, but certainly functional enough and pretty fast to authenticate compared to under-display sensors. And what I do love is there is a two-stage camera shutter key on this phone to easily jump into the camera and also half press to focus and snap a shot. On the bottom, you'll find the USB Type-C port for charging. It provides up to 18 watts, and to top up the 3,330 milliamp hour capacity cell, it takes about roughly an hour and a half. Not bad, but this is definitely not the biggest battery in the world, especially on such a large 6.5-inch 4K display. It's not really a battery endurance champion, and it does not have Qi wireless charging on the back glass either. That being said, it does have stereo speakers on the bottom, and the earpiece serves as the second unit, and because of how tall this phone is, it does provide excellent stereo separation when you're watching back videos, very immersive, although there is no 3.5mm headphone jack, though standard Bluetooth as well as NFC, GPS are built on in. Also, like most flagship Japanese smartphones, it's going to be fully waterproof and dust resistant as well. And what's good is despite the stretched aspect ratio, the weight distribution feels decent as you're holding it in the hands. Again, slightly more narrow frame means that it doesn't feel too unwieldy unless you're trying to reach all the way to the very top of the screen. We have very thin bezels on the bottom and also the top that also houses the front-facing camera along with the earpiece, so there is no cutouts on the display such as a hole punch or a teardrop. It just is an uninterrupted 6.5-inch panel, which is actually quite elegant and beautiful to look at even now here in 2023. Sony's skin on top of Android, aka Xperia UI, is also extremely clean and pretty stock feeling aside from a few utility tools and extras that they throw on in. The phone, by the way, is also powered by the Qualcomm Snapdragon 855 processor. It's a pretty tried and tested octa-core 7nm chip. It is 4G LTE, but performance is actually surprisingly still very strong, as we have seen in other throwback videos on devices like the Samsung Galaxy S10 series. Everyday usage still feels zippy, including even some gaming here and there. Nothing really feels slow at all, although this is a 60Hz refresh rate on the panel as opposed to a faster one. Now, by the way, it shipped with Android 9.0 Pie and since received upgrades up to Android 11. It's not the newest in terms of certain manufacturers may provide even longer term support than Sony, but at the very least, you can still download the latest content from the Play Store without any problems, and thankfully it does support gesture navigation as well. The device does come with a standard kind of Google News feed on the left-hand side, as well as all the regular apps, including Chrome, Maps, the suite of Office tools, and Play Store, of course, built on in. Aside from that, there's also a game enhancer, which increases the haptics on the device and reduces any background apps to optimize on your memory and CPU when you're gaming. And there's also, more importantly, their Cinema Pro app, which really takes video to the next level. We'll take a closer look at that later on, but you'll also find a PS app, so it allows you to do some remote play functionality if you have a newer generation PlayStation. In fact, there's an Epic's game app that is preloaded, but you can uninstall it if not being used. And there's also a function that Sony calls Edge Sense. You can double tap on the side bezel to bring up some additional contextual menus for easily switching into multitasking. It's not 100% always reactive compared to kind of the squeeze edge function on HTC phones and on some Google Pixel devices, but it's still a thoughtful software extra. Utility tools, though, including a built-in music player, are designed by Sony and actually quite thoughtful since Android doesn't come with its own music app anymore. And that's more or less it. Everything else, including even the clock app as well as the calculator app, are completely faithful to regular Android. What you see on this particular device are some carrier exclusive from Docomo, the Japanese variant of this phone, but thankfully a lot of those can be disabled or uninstalled, and if you're picking up the global unlocked variant, you shouldn't really see those on your device to begin with. Now, we'll also talk briefly about pricing. So unfortunately, Sony's devices have always tended to be not perhaps the best value per se if you're looking just at the specs alone. And even to this day, their Xperia 1 line tends to be perhaps a bit more expensive than what I would really like it to be. However, one reason why this first generation Xperia 1 I think is also interesting to look at is it has now finally come down a lot in terms of cost. You can find it on third-party sites, including eBay, for around $150 to $200, sometimes even less than that if you shop around. Finally putting it into budget territory for still a very well-performing flagship-grade phone, and if you're trying to get a taste of this newer design language from Sony, it can be worth exploring, even though it's not the cheapest 855 phone that we have come across. So just jumping directly into the camera next, the UI is still quite simple, but if we zoom on in, there are some auto AI detection functions that can recognize what you're pointing at and kind of change the scene automatically. You can tap here to easily jump into the 2x optical zoom, as well as tap again to jump into the widescreen camera instead. You can also pinch in and out and tap on the widescreen icon instead to jump into that view if you prefer. What I do like though is that they have spaced the camera as well as the camcorder function separately on this tab. So it's a little easier to jump back and forth between these two modes. There's also Google Lens integration for scanning in things like QR codes and barcodes. You can activate the portrait mode here just by tapping this icon, and advanced settings are okay. You can change obviously the resolution, object tracking, and skin softening for faces, but there isn't kind of a manual HDR mode that's found here. A mode button at the bottom here does bring along options like slow-mo capture as well as panorama, and there is a manual mode for changing things like ISO and white balance. What that means is if you are capturing in difficult lighting situations, such as facing the sun, it does have an HDR processing mode, but you have to kind of give it a split second for the AI to recognize it and then switch into that profile. So that is something I found about Sony's phones, is that their software and processing often is a step or half step behind the technical capability of their sensors, which are world-class. After all, a lot of the Sony sensors and camera lenses are used on other manufacturers' smartphones, including even Google Pixel devices, but they're able to just tweak it and take it to the next level using software algorithms. And I hate to admit it, but that's the part where I've always wanted Sony to further improve on, but perhaps with more limited software engineering as compared to brands like Google, they aren't quite able to hit, even if the hardware sensors are top-notch. But anyways, you get satisfactory looking results on here when it comes to still photography. In fact, it's really nothing to scoff at and still looks quite decent to this day when it comes to colors. If you're just slightly more patient with it, giving it a split second for the AI to detect, and optimize the scene correctly, you can still get very satisfactory looking results. But what it doesn't do quite as well in would be in super rapid shot environments. Trying to capture something at a moment's notice, sometimes the processing there can be a bit more hit or miss. The leaves on this tree here also have plenty of detail and vibrancy, and overall, again, it's a pretty decent shooter, just have to be maybe perhaps a split second more patient with it. That being said, when it comes to video recording capabilities, I would argue that's really the forte of the Xperia 1 line. And make that argument because it's really there that Sony has done a lot more R&D and development, and also a UI that you don't quite get on any other smartphone in their catalog outside of the Xperia 1 line. It's actually quite reminiscent of some of their more pro-grade point-and-shoot digital cameras on the market, some DSLRs even. Plus, it is capturing in stereo microphones as well with the left and the right side, so sound pickup is also beautifully done. You can even change the color grading directly on this device just by toggling the look here on the side, so a lot of fine controls that filmmakers will enjoy. And perhaps that is one slight issue, arguably, with Sony devices, is they are catering for a more niche crowd, content creators looking for an excellent video recording device, as well as a media consumption phone. From the perspective of reaching a broader demographic, it might not be the best decision, but it also makes me just like Sony phones that much more, since they are very unique and distinctive. So anyways, let's do a quick demo of the audio quality and video playback next. So overall, it is a very enjoyable experience, again, with just this full screen display without any notches or interruptions, combined with the high pixel density that is just crystal sharp, even if you're looking at it super closely, and the stereo speakers make for a very immersive overall view. That being said, one thing you will notice is because of the ultra-wide aspect ratio, you do get a little bit larger cropping going on, or black bars, if you are looking at regular 16:9 content. So if you zoom all the way in, you will be cutting off parts of the frame unless you're looking at media optimized for this format, which is still, as much as I hate to say it, a little bit on the scarce side unless you're looking at, for example, Netflix shows or certain movie files that you download or watch on the device yourself. So that is one slight disadvantage of having a screen which is so wide that is perhaps not the industry norm when it comes to mobile devices just yet. Anyways, you can also turn on the dynamic vibration function, which, as we talked about, basically uses haptic vibrations to buzz whenever you're listening at a bass drop or a drum beat, for example, in music, just adding a little bit more of flavor to your media consumption experience. Kind of interesting. We also did see it on the Xperia XZ3. Reception quality was generally not an issue, both with cellular as well as dual band Wi-Fi. I was generally getting almost full bars even when a little bit further away from the router, so videos tend to load up quite quickly even if you're playing it back up to 4K res. And as far as web browsing is concerned, I would say that it's also a generally fast and responsive experience, again, thanks to the Snapdragon 855 chip, but the super tall aspect ratio makes it interesting, because when we think about devices like the iPad, they actually try actively to push the aspect ratio closer to a boxy 4:3, and the argument is it feels more like a piece of paper or a newspaper that perhaps is more intuitive for things like productivity, versus on here you may have to scroll a little bit more because it's going to push more lines since the screen is more narrow. That being said, colors are still super vibrant, and again, it's more than capable enough when it comes to even demanding web pages. Things are still loading back at a relatively quick speed. Plus, you can technically, again, use it in the 21:9 multi-window view, for example, browsing the web on the top while doing something else like taking notes at the bottom, and actually that does feel a little bit more intuitive since the aspect ratio becomes more boxy as a result. That being said, when you do find content that is optimized for this ultra-wide aspect ratio, whether that's movies or TV shows, it just is spectacular. And there is some content that you can still find on YouTube in this aspect ratio if you look hard enough. And as far as gaming is concerned, there are certain titles like Asphalt 9 which have been optimized to fill the 21:9 aspect ratio, and you get an amazing experience. But then, just like with watching back YouTube videos, there is still the majority of games optimized for 2:1 or 16:9 that will result in some larger black bars on the left and right sides when you are playing them back. So it's another instance where the taller aspect ratio might be a little bit hit or miss, to be completely honest, but when you do find content that works, it can be a pretty magical experience. As you can tell here, when it comes to overall frame rates, even on demanding titles like Asphalt 9, the 855 chip keeps along really without any problems at all. Again, the excellent haptics combined with the good stereo speakers just bring the experience to the next level. So that is the Sony Xperia 1, the first generation model revisited here in 2023. Overall, I would say there's still plenty of horsepower underneath the hood here when it comes to daily usage and even doing some more demanding gaming, as you saw there, with titles like PUBG and Asphalt not really posing an issue for this chip to handle quite well. Very clean software experience with just a few extras that add to the overall functionality of the device. And after using one of these 21:9 devices, I kind of like it, I have to say, almost like a guilty pleasure. Yes, the majority of content might not be optimized for a view like this, but undeniably there's a lot of character here, and when you do find, again, content that aligns, it just seems like a magical experience. The vibrancy and sharpness of this display is definitely world-class, and remains actually the same res even on their latest gen variant of this device. So if you're looking for a little bit more of a quirky experimental phone and you really want to prioritize areas including entertainment as well as video recording, that can be a reason to pick up, again, the Sony Xperia 1, now that, again, the pricing has fallen to kind of a budget territory. That being said, just be aware that there are compromises here, and it's definitely not for folks that want something conservative. Thanks for watching this revisited review here at OS Reviews. That's been the Sony Xperia 1 first gen here in 2023.